Donc merci à tous d'être là et de rester après ce film pour ce débat. Je vous présente nos invités ce soir. Donc nous avons tout d'abord Monsieur Babul Akhter qui est ici à côté de nous, qui représente les travailleurs du textile au Bangladesh. And I guess I should start speaking English like this. It's easier for everybody to understand. So representing the workers in the textile industry in Bangladesh. Thank you to have come from Bangladesh. We have Ryder here on my left from the International Labour Organization. We have Nicole Voillat next to him, who works in Bata. And we have also Madame Luginbühl, Christa Luginbühl, who's from the Berne Declaration and in charge of the Clean Clothes campaign. She'll explain to us what exactly it is that the Clean Clothes campaign. So maybe the first question for you, Mr. Akhter, because we saw a lot of what's happening in Bangladesh after the Rana Plaza. What is the situation now at the moment? What could you say is the situation of the worker generally in Bangladesh?
Thank you. But this is a question for me. I think I will say I will use my mother language and someone will help me. তো রানা প্লাজার পর আসলে অল্প অল্প করে পরিবর্তন হচ্ছে, কিন্তু সেটা তুলনামূলকভাবে অনেক কম। যেভাবে হওয়ার কথা ছিল এবং যেভাবে আমরা আমাদের শ্রমিক সংগঠনগুলোর পক্ষে আমরা চেয়েছি, আসলে সেটা এখনো ধীরগতিতেই হচ্ছে।
After the Rana Plaza tragedy, things are changing, but the pace at which it is changing is deplorable.
তো রানা প্লাজার পরে আমরা শুধুমাত্র ওয়ার্কারদের নিরাপত্তার বিষয়টি অ্যাকর্ড অ্যালায়েন্স এবং ন্যাশনাল অ্যাকশন প্ল্যান নিরাপত্তাটির বিষয়ে দেখে যাচ্ছেন, কিন্তু এটার জন্য আরও অনেক সময় দরকার। Actually, after Rana Plaza, three initiatives we take: Accord, Alliance, and National Action Plan. Accord is European, more than 200 brand is on coalition like this, and is Alliance is American few brand. This is voluntary for the worker safety, and Action Plan is ILO and Bangladesh government and the manufacturer. This is joint initiative for the workers' safety. So actually, after Rana Plaza, these three things we seen, and they are working for the only worker safety issue, but not other things, as like a freedom of association and not a workers' others condition.
Thank you. What's happening in Bangladesh is not only happening in Bangladesh, and I think it's important to stress that tonight. Ryder, who is the most responsible about what's happening?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question, but just before I answer it, I mean, just watching that film and having celebrated International Women's Day yesterday, you know, one of the most important, one of the most tragic textile factory accidents in history was over 100 years ago. It was at the origin of International Women's Day. It took place in New York City. It was in the heart of global capitalism today. This is a global problem. I think the case of Bangladesh, the case of garments and textiles, tells a very strong story, and it is emblematic of the problem. But what we're facing today, I think, is a task of trying to install acceptable conditions of work in global supply chains which cover about 20% of workers in the global economy, which is international, every region is affected, and covers every sector. Now, garment and textiles is particularly important because it's probably the most mobile of all capital sectors. You know, if the brands and the producers find wages in Bangladesh have got too high or conditions too constraining, they'll go to the next destination. And then two next destinations are very clearly mapped out already. They're Myanmar and they're Ethiopia. This is what the brands are talking about. Now, who's to blame? and who is responsible. One thing about the film, which I don't know if anybody else in the room noticed it, there was a glaring absence in that film, and it was government. Government wasn't there. There was no politician there. There was no minister there. And I think they're the missing responsible partner in this process. So governments have to live up to their responsibilities. The government of Bangladesh is the first to have responsibilities towards its own people. After that, and we could talk a lot more about what that involves, proper legislation, proper labor inspection, proper investment regimes. And then you've got two parts of the business community, and it sort of came out in the film, but not altogether. You've got the local business community in Bangladesh, the employers, the people who employ the people you saw in that film. And then you've got the brands whose names you see in the high streets of Geneva, of London, of New York. They're different people, and they're quite skilled at passing off the responsibility one to the other along the supply chain. So I think you've got to work out what the respective responsibilities of each of those two players is. And then you have labor, and I have to pay tribute to Babul and what he's doing. The Bangladesh labor movement operates in extremely difficult conditions, but it exists. You have international labor, which has been at the heart of the response to Rana Plaza. And then you've got, and we'll hear from them I'm sure soon, you've got consumers and you've got civil society. And I think consumers have an enormous capacity to make a difference here. I think the one thing that constrains consumers in acting even more than they do already is the absence of reliable information. I happen to believe that if people know going into that shop that that garment or that product has been made by people working in lethal conditions or child labor or forced labor, they will react. I don't think the extra 2 or 3 Swiss francs makes a difference. It's getting that reliable information to them that will make a difference.
Christa, maybe it's important to talk to you now because Christa Luginbühl from the Declaration of Berne Clean Clothes campaign, that's exactly what you're aiming to do. You're working here in Switzerland. Explain maybe in a few words what is the Clean Clothes campaign?
Yes, thank you. The Clean Clothes campaign is a global network. We want to bring together the workers and the consumers, and we want to jointly improve the working conditions. We are not calling for boycott, and I want to underline that in all our criticism, we are not calling for a boycott, neither for a country, like, for instance, Bangladesh, that now got all this unfortunate and bad reputation. We are also not calling for a boycott of a brand, but we call for an improvement of the situation, because we know the workers do need the jobs, but what they need is not just any job, but a decent job, and that's what we want to jointly achieve. And I think maybe if you allow me just a brief reaction on what Guy just said about the different actors. Of course, governments, I agree, they were absent, but I think we cannot ignore also the power imbalances that we have. And I just want to remind everyone that some of the most wealthiest people on this planet, they do belong to the fashion industry. If you take, for instance, the owner or one of the main shareholder of Inditex, the Spanish brand, he has a personal asset of approximately $70 billion US. So that is massive. He is about the number.
Inditex being Zara.
Yes, he is the number 4.
Known.
The list changes a bit, but about the number 4 of the wealthiest people worldwide. If you take the main shareholder of H&M, the personal asset of Mr. Persson is about $30 billion US. So it is massive, massive money we talk about, and we cannot forget that. And I'm not saying governments are not responsible, but a power imbalance exists, and that plays a huge role.
We have among us Christine Voillat, on va la présenter en français parce que c'est Nicole, pardon, excusez-moi. Nicole Voillat qui est une Tessinoise, donc qui parle très bien français. Vous travaillez pour Bata. Bata qui est présent au Bangladesh comme d'ailleurs dans nombreux pays dans le monde, avec une différence peut-être notable par rapport à certaines compagnies dont on a parlé ce soir, c'est que vos employés au Bangladesh sont vos employés, ils ne sont pas sous-traités. Qu'est-ce que ça change ?
Oui, c'est juste. Bata est présente au Bangladesh depuis 70 ans et à 2 usines dans le pays. Et comme dans tous les autres pays où nous avons des usines, nous produisons seulement pour le marché local. Donc, c'est-à-dire que les chaussures que nous produisons, vous ne les trouverez pas à Zurich ou à New York ou je ne sais pas où. Il faut aussi dire que, contrairement disons, à différence d'autres compagnies qui produisent des chaussures, Bata, c'est une compagnie familiale qui existe, comme j'ai dit, depuis 120 ans. Non, je ne l'ai pas dit, depuis 120 ans. Et donc, nous sommes présents dans 24 pays, dans plus de 90 pays, mais dans 24 pays, nous avons des usines. Et c'est là où nous produisons surtout pour le marché local.
Le salaire moyen à peu près au Bangladesh, dans une de vos usines?
Pardon?
Le salaire moyen?
Donc, pour disons, un employé qui produit la chaussure, le salaire moyen, c'est autour de $460. Il faut dire aussi qu'au Bangladesh, donc, on emploie plus de 2200 personnes et que la moyenne d'âge est 42, c'est-à-dire que nos gens ils restent beaucoup chez nous. Et l'année passée, on a fêté 309 employés qui ont travaillé chez nous plus de 25 ans. Donc, voilà. C'est, comme j'ai dit, c'est une entreprise familiale, donc c'est le long terme qui est important parce que la prochaine génération, elle veut continuer à travailler dans la chaussure.
Babul, we heard here an average salary of $450 or $60 per month, and workers who work for a long time for the same company. Is it the normal life of the regular worker in textile industry in Bangladesh?
আসলে বাটা কোম্পানিতে যে বেতনের কথাটা বলা হয়েছে সেটা ওয়ার্কার লেভেলে কিনা আমার সন্দেহ আছে এবং এটা মনে হয় যে মিড লেভেল কর্মকর্তাদের জন্য
The wages that Ms. Nicole quoted about workers, so he doubts that it is for the workers, it might be for mid-level managerial posts.
গার্মেন্টস কারখানায় যে আসলে বর্তমানে পৃথিবীর ভিতরে সবচেয়ে গার্মেন্টস ওয়ার্কারদের ন্যূনতম মজুরি হলো যে $68.
So the monthly wage for workers in the garment sector is around $68 a month.
And is, yeah.
Okay, আমি আসলে আর একটু অল্প বলতে চাচ্ছি যদি সময় দেয়
Yeah, he wants to speak for a little more, if time permits.
বাংলাদেশে এখন বর্তমানে 5000 গার্মেন্টস কারখানা আছে যেখানে 4.5 মিলিয়ন গার্মেন্টস শ্রমিক কাজ করে
There are 5,000 garment factories in Bangladesh at the moment where around 4 million workers work there.
আমি একজন গার্মেন্টস ওয়ার্কার ছিলাম এবং 5 বছরের বেশি কারখানায় কাজ করেছি আমি জানি এখানে গার্মেন্টস শ্রমিকদের অনেক সমস্যা রয়ে গেছে
He's worked at the garment sector as a worker for over 5 years, and he's well aware of the toils and the struggle of the workers there.
যতটুকু আমাদের এখন ধীরে ধীরে যতটুকু পরিবর্তন হচ্ছে সেটা আমাদের যে ম্যানুফ্যাকচারের সদিচ্ছা না এবং সরকারের ইচ্ছে না শুধুমাত্র সাপ্লাই চেইনে বা প্রেসারের কারণেই এটা একটু পরিবর্তনের দিকে যাচ্ছে
The little changes that have happened, the slow-paced change that has happened, it's not because of the pressure from the government or the pressure from these garment factory owners. It's only because of the pressure from the supply chain.
এবং সাপ্লাই চেইন অর্থাৎ যে ব্র্যান্ড আছে তাদের যে কোড অফ কন্ট্রাক্ট আছে সেটা যদি বাস্তবায়ন হয় ঠিকভাবে তাহলে আমাদের দেশের যে শ্রমিকদের যে অধিকারগুলো আছে সহজভাবে বাস্তবায়ন হবে
So basically the brands, they have certain codes of conduct, and only that can affect a little bit of change that can be brought about.
এবং বাংলাদেশের যে গার্মেন্টস কারখানার মালিকগুলো তারা খুবই শক্তিশালী এবং তারা এবং তাদের ভূমিকা এবং সরকারের ভূমিকা আমরা অনেক সময় একইভাবে দেখি এবং আমরা বুঝতে পারি না যে আসলে কে সরকার এবং কে ম্যানুফ্যাকচার।
So the owners of these factories often occupy parliamentarian posts, and they are also, so the collusion between the government and these garment factory owners is it's so present that it's difficult to bring about change.
আপনারা রানা প্লাজার কথা বলেছেন, যে রানা প্লাজা বা তাজরিন ফ্যাশনের অগ্নিকাণ্ড, এগুলো যদি আমাদের সরকার যদি ঠিকভাবে যে আইন বাস্তবায়ন করতো, তাহলে মালিকেরা আইন মেনে চললে এই ধরনের ঘটনা ঘটতো না এবং এভাবে হাজার খানেক শ্রমিকের মৃত্যুবরণ করতে হতো না।
Had the garment factory owners followed the code of conduct, then a lot of lives, more than 1,000 lives at Rana Plaza could have been saved. And if the government implemented it.
And what would you want to say to the audience and to the consumers?
আসলে আমি এখানে যেটা বলতে চাই, যারা কনজিউমার আছে তাদেরকে আমি অনুরোধ করব তারা বাংলাদেশি প্রোডাক্ট বেশি বেশি কেনেন। এই সাথে সাথে যে স্টোর থেকে কিনেন সেখানকার যে ম্যানেজার আছে তাকে বলেন এই পোশাকটা যেখান থেকে আসছে তারা সম্মানের সহিত কাজটা করতে পারছে কিনা এবং তারা ন্যায্য মজুরি পায় কিনা, এটা যদি জিজ্ঞেস করে তাহলেই আসলে কনজিউমার যদি বলে তাহলে ব্র্যান্ড মানে ইন্টারন্যাশনাল যে ব্র্যান্ড আছে তারা সেটা শুনবে এবং সেই ব্র্যান্ডই বাংলাদেশের মালিককে বলবে যে আসলে এখন সময় আসছে যে শ্রমিকদের অধিকার দিতে হবে আর তাদেরকে ঠকানো যাবে না, তাহলেই বাংলাদেশের শ্রমিকেরা ভালো মজুরি পাবে। তাই আমি কনজিউমারদের অনুরোধ করছি তারা যাতে এটুক করে।
So he urges the consumers to buy products that are manufactured in Bangladesh more and more, and also to go and talk to, say, the manager at the store and inquire about the living conditions of the workers, if they're being paid properly, proper wages, if they're able to live a life of dignity, and put a pressure on the managers so that it goes up the hierarchy, and then a similar pressure is created on the garment factory owners in Bangladesh. Only then can change be effected.
এবং আসলে এই গার্মেন্টস সেক্টরের সাথে যে এখানে 4.5 মিলিয়ন গার্মেন্টস শ্রমিক আছে, যার ভিতরে 85% ইয়ং নারী শ্রমিক, এবং এর সাথে আরও যে সমস্ত কলকারখানা তৈরি হচ্ছে সেখানেও অনেক নারী শ্রমিক কাজ করে। অতএব তাদের জন্যই আসলে এই কাজটা আমাদের দরকার।
Out of the 4.5 million workers who work in this garment sector and also other sectors in Bangladesh, more than 85% are women, and we need it for the women in Bangladesh and elsewhere.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Christa, can we say that the consumer here knows that the clothes are produced in this way? And we heard about 52 collections a year, not like 2 or 4, 52. Does the consumer needs or wants that many change of clothes?
Yeah, I mean, the question about need, I think that's a very rhetoric question, of course. Or, in other words, everyone, of course, has to decide by him or herself. But I think what we have to be aware is that this industry is really causing, it's the characteristic of this industry, and part of it is this invention of fast fashion that is causing situations that are really problematic, and that is true for all the production countries all over the world. You have a very labor-intensive industry, so you need a lot of people that are doing in long working hours and by hand actually these clothes. You have a huge time pressure, you have a huge price pressure, you have a huge mobility, as already mentioned, and you have this actually this push to overconsumption, and this creates conditions that are so difficult, not only in Bangladesh but all over the world, even in Europe and even in the EU. And I think this, of course, it has to touch us, it has to concern us. We cannot close the eyes. I think ignorance is the worst thing that can happen.
So what would you tell the audience to do? What would you advise the consumer to do?
Well, I think one first step is, of course, like so many people came here and saw this movie and listened to this debate and enter in this exchange. That's one first important step. I think, as I said, ignorance is the worst. So it's about getting to know the conditions. It's about sharing the knowledge. It's about acting, reacting in stores. It's about questioning yourself. What do you really need? Where do you buy it? How much do you buy it? Do you maybe change clothes instead of buying everything new? So these are all questions that are important. And I think one thing is clear, we cannot go on in this same speed. I think it has been said very clearly also in the film. I mean, this is simply devastating. It is devastating for the people that create this clothes. It's devastating for the nature. It's in the end also devastating for us consumers, because I don't believe anybody can feel really good with a huge pile of clothes knowing that they have been produced in unhuman conditions.
Okay. Guy Ryder, this last 15, 20 years, and this fast fashion has developed, and we saw that the prices of production actually went up, but the prices of the clothes themselves went down. And is there anything that you can do at the level you are to fight against that?
Yeah, it's quite interesting, isn't it? This phenomenon. I mean, what we have to, I think, give some attention to is a distribution of the return to value added along the chain. And you will, if you go and speak to the local employers in Dhaka or in other countries, they will complain and complain very vigorously that they are placed in an impossible position by the demands of the buyers, who increasingly push down the price that they're willing to pay for goods, and particularly reduce the production times, the order times. So I think it's really important to re-look at the distribution of the returns to value. That's the only way in the end you're going to get wages up on the shop floor. Now, I want to come back to this notion of the shared responsibility of the different actors. I absolutely agree with Christa that the inequalities of power are at the center of this debate. I, over the time I've been working on these issues, do not believe in the interest, capacity, or will of private enterprises to redress that imbalance of power if you leave them to themselves. That's what governments are there for. Governments are there to correct and redress the imbalances of power. Now, how can this be done? Just take a couple of examples. I'll take one from my own country. I happen to be British, as you probably noticed. We just had, this last year, an anti-slavery law introduced in the UK. 13,000 slaves in the United Kingdom. And one of the better pieces in an imperfect law is the requirement that companies with a sufficient level of production, of turnover, are required to report on what they have done to make sure that there is no forced labor in their supply chains. The French Senate is looking at a similar piece of legislation in France. These are the sorts of things we need to be doing. We need to be requiring, as the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights want us to do, that companies exercise what is phrased as due diligence. Due diligence. They need to take care of what is happening in their supply chains. That's not happening today. Social auditing does not get the job done. Rana Plaza had been subject to repeated social audits and given the okay. We've got to do better than that.
There are some improvements, though. You mentioned yourself. It seems in the movie we heard a lot about American companies. And is there a difference between American companies and European companies?
I think Babul will probably speak with greater authority than me, but there have been two remarkable international initiatives since Rana Plaza, and a direct consequence of Rana Plaza. There is the International Accord on building and fire safety in the industry, which is basically a joint effort by international trade union movement and some 200 buyers sourcing in Bangladesh, mostly Europeans with some others, but the US buyers did not join in. They didn't join in that process basically because their lawyers will not let US companies accept or recognize any liability, even voluntary liability, for conditions down their supply chains. So the US businesses did their own thing in an international alliance, which I think is smaller. But what's the result? Yeah, most of the factories in Bangladesh have now been inspected for structural safety. Remedial action has not been completed, but we're pushing to make that happen so that people going to work to escape poverty don't have to go into a death trap to do that. At the same time, in Bangladesh, we're trying to get them to change their laws. They have changed their laws to recognize trade union rights. In my view, they've gone halfway to what they need to do, and there are major obstacles still in Bangladesh. We're helping them put in place a labor inspection service, which prior to Rana Plaza simply did not work, didn't really operate in any effective way. And one thing, and it might sound a soft issue, we're trying to do training. We are trying to work with employers in textile factories, and indeed with the trade union movement, so that they understand that, an employer can understand that a trade union is not a threat to their business. A trade union can actually help them to operate as a sustainable business. There's a major sort of mindset change that involves.
Yes.
আমি আসলে যে আইএলও রিপ্রেজেন্টেটিভ যে কথাগুলো বলছে তার কিছু কিছু বিষয়ের সাথে বাংলাদেশ পার্টি আমি একমত না।
He doesn't agree with whatever Mr. Ryder has to say. Not everything. Not everything. I'm sorry.
যে আসলে বাংলাদেশে রানা প্লাজার পরে যে আইন সংশোধন হয়েছে এবং সর্বশেষ যে শ্রম বিধিমালা হয়েছে সেখানে ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন গঠনকে আরো জটিল করে দিয়েছে।
So the changes that have happened in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh have basically made the trade union movement in Bangladesh more complicated and more complex and difficult.
Actually, after Rana Plaza, we had no labor rules, and we get on labor rules last year, 15 September. But we've seen these rules is make it more difficult to form the freedom of association. So
yeah, maybe the beginning, because the beginning, I think.
Okay, so in the aftermath, the rules that were formed have basically made association more complex and difficult.
After Rana Plaza, actually trade union 2013, it was easy for us. 2014 is going to difficult, and 2015 was more difficult
Even
for
more
a
difficult.
trade union registration.
But what about the pressure from the companies? Is there a difference if they're American companies or if they're European companies?
It's a good question. Actually, the American all brand is Walmart, Gap, and others, maybe 17 brand, is they take a voluntary initiative. It's called the Alliance. But is the Accord is not voluntary. I think this is some legal bindings. So actually, the Accord is the trade union and brand agreement on things, but is the Alliance not that. So what Alliance doing in Bangladesh, actually we don't know. They are doing with the businessmen, not trade union. So we support Accord, and for this reason we are giving thanks to Accord all brand who signed the Accord.
Thank you. Nicole, Voillat, vous êtes aussi donc présente au Bangladesh, on l'a dit, et dans d'autres pays. Vous avez certainement la pression de certaines de ces compagnies low cost, si on peut dire, ou fast fashion qu'on a vues, qui d'ailleurs se mettent aussi à faire des chaussures, je crois. Est-ce que vous sentez que l'industrie a changé ?
C'est difficile à dire parce que, comme j'ai dit, nous, on ne dessert que la population locale. Donc, pour nous, les grandes marques ne représentent pas grand-chose. Nous, on fait surtout des chaussures pour les personnes dans le pays. Donc, c'est évidemment...
Et ici
et pas pour ici.
Non, mais ici, vous sentez la pression ?
Ici, la pression par rapport à ça. Nous, disons, tous nos fournisseurs, presque tous nos fournisseurs sont en Europe. On a aussi des fournisseurs en Chine, mais la majorité de nos chaussures qui sont vendues ici en Europe sont faites en Europe. Bien sûr, on sent la pression et
Est-ce que le prix de vos chaussures reste sensiblement le même ou est-ce qu'il baisse comme le prix des habits?
moi, je ne pense pas qu'il baisse énormément. Je pense que nos prix, ils ont plutôt augmenté. On était une marque de chaussures plutôt populaire. Aussi, on était en Suisse pendant plusieurs années. On avait aussi une usine en Suisse jusqu'à il y a quelques années à Möhlin, à Aargau, où d'ailleurs on avait aussi tout un village autour de cette usine où nos employés pouvaient habiter à très bas prix. Et on a dû fermer parce qu'évidemment, on a eu beaucoup de pression des pays en voie de développement ou émergents avec des prix très bas et surtout la Chine jusqu'à à peu près dans les années 70, on avait plus de 100 usines dans le monde et on en avait plusieurs en Europe aussi, en France, en Angleterre et notamment ici en Suisse et on a dû fermer. Et maintenant, il nous reste encore une entreprise, une usine qui fait des chaussures pour l'Europe en Tchéquie, en République tchèque, et puis encore en Hollande. Donc, au niveau des entreprises qui produisent et qui vendent des chaussures, Bata, c'est à peu près une des seules entreprises qui a encore autant de usines de chaussures. C'est à peu près 50% de notre production que c'est fait avec nos usines dans le monde entier, de la Bolivie jusqu'en Nouvelle-Zélande d'ailleurs.
Guy Ryder, we heard that we heard that the consumers sometimes think that if they stop shopping, then the economy is going to collapse. Is there something wrong with the shopper or with the economy?
It would be a disaster if we stopped shopping from all perspectives. By the way, one of the reasons that we've got 200 million people unemployed around the world is that we're not spending enough money. Demand is not in the economy. So, I was a little bit, whilst I understand and agree with the notion that we've got to redirect our methods, our way of consuming, we've got to redirect that into sustainable directions, but it's certainly not a matter of, stop buying goods. And this is where I think the key point that's been made by Babul really matters. We want that Bangladesh industry, for example, garment industry, to prosper. We don't want to get rid of it. And that's why many of the activities taking place are based on the notion of sustainability, economic, social, environmental sustainability of the industry. Now, the garment industry matters enormously to countries which are trying to launch into that developmental phase of industrialization. And all of our history shows that you've got to make that step in order to increase living standards in a significant way. Textiles is a way that happened in Europe 150 years ago. That's how we all started. So we can't pull up the ladder and stop these industries prospering. So it's about sustainability. Yes, I agree. The methods of consuming, the way we're consuming is not responsible. It's not good. I'm not going to make a moral critique of it, but from an economic and social, environmental point of view, I don't think it is sustainable. But we don't sort of turn the whole thing off.
Christa, Luginbühl, we heard Babul before saying that the consumer should put pressure on the brands, should say how this garment is made and was the worker well paid or properly paid. Do you think that it can be as easy as that, or that it could work? You could go in the shop in H&M or C&A or other shops like that and say that sort of thing. What sort of reaction would you get?
Well, of course it is. I don't think you will, in most shops, get a very extensive answers. However, as a consumer, I mean, as you, for instance, ask for a certain quality or price, of course it is very relevant that you give feedback what you actually expect, and that's that the people are not exploited from the people that are actually making these clothes. So I do think this reaction is important, at least that's also what I hear when I talk to companies, and maybe Nicole can say something on that later. And maybe also to add here, we have seen some brands featuring here, some fast fashion brands, and I want to acknowledge that Nicole came here because I also want to tell that, I know that the organizers try very hard to get some of these bigger brands also to sit here. They got rejected from Benetton, they got rejected from H&M, they got rejected from Inditex. I think, honestly, it is a shame that nobody from these brands came here to sit and debate. And we also made sometimes similar experience as Clean Clothes campaign, where we invited H&M to sit on a public panel. They didn't want to sit there because, in a way, you can say it's not controllable. After the panel, they invited us for a private discussion. No, that's actually not how debates should go. That should be public, and people should get their own opinion about the situation. So I really think it's a shame that these companies did not come.
So what sort of... You say they wouldn't come, but what sort of contact do you have with them? Are they willing to work towards a better, cleaner clothes campaigns?
I think we get very mixed reactions. I also think over the years you can see, of course, that campaigns do leave traces and have an impact. For instance, when we in 2009 or 10 as Clean Clothes campaign first started to really broadly talk about living wage, the first reaction was like, yeah, we pay the minimum wage, so that's all fine. I think a lot of companies today would agree that actually in no production country, nowhere in the world, minimum wage is enough really to have a decent wage. So in that sense, they also had to give in and face certain problems. Now that does not mean yet that the problems are solved, of course, but I think it shows that the louder we say and we also point to things and the more public we do it, it is getting more difficult for brands to ignore and to not get active. And I think that's really something that is not just in the shoes as a consumer, but it's also a citizen's attitude that we actually should take. And also that is then going back to what Guy said, of course, also the governments here do have a responsibility to actually hold companies accountable for what they do in their global supply chains. Because of course responsibility is not stopping in the border of a country, it is going through the global supply chains and we are getting it back in the product, and this is also a task, a duty that the governments do have.
Nicole, as you're the only one representing the brands, and I thank you once more to do that. Voulez-vous répondre quelque chose, puisque vous êtes la seule représentante des marques ce soir? Non, à ce que Madame Luginbühl demandait en disant qu'elle estimait que de la part des grandes marques, il y avait une certaine réticence, voire plus.
Oui, je suis sûre, il y a certainement des marques qui sont réticentes. Je pense que d'ici, disons depuis 10-15 ans, depuis qu'on parle beaucoup plus de la responsabilité sociale des entreprises, je pense qu'il y a beaucoup d'entreprises qui se sont vraiment donné beaucoup de la peine pour essayer de faire quelque chose. Et d'ailleurs, toutes ces marques dont on parlait ce soir, en la majorité, ils ont des départements de RSE, de responsabilité sociale des entreprises. Je mentionne seulement, par exemple, à H&M, ils ont plus de 100 personnes qui travaillent pour la RSE. Donc, il y a une certaine mobilisation. Évidemment, les défis sont grands. Hein. Je pense qu'on a fait pas mal de pas en avant, mais qu'on est encore loin d'avoir tout résolu. Il y a beaucoup de défis parce que, surtout quand on parle de la supply chain, donc de la chaîne d'approvisionnement, elle est extrêmement complexe. Et pouvoir vraiment connaître à fond la traçabilité d'un produit, c'est vraiment très très difficile. Et je pense que même les grandes marques comme Nike ou Adidas ou Puma, qui est un petit peu, moi je parle maintenant des chaussures, qui sont un petit peu les leaders dans ce domaine, même eux, ils connaissent pas ça. Donc c'est vraiment du work in progress. Et je fais seulement l'exemple de la Chine, que je connais un petit peu. Pour chaque fournisseur, il y a au moins 5 sous-traitants. Et ces sous-traitants, ils changent tout le temps. Parce que c'est de nouveau le fournisseur, qu'un jour il travaille avec un jour avec l'autre, etc. Donc c'est un marché très mobile et c'est très difficile de le fixer. Mais je pense que les entreprises, ils font beaucoup au jour d'aujourd'hui. Et il y a la bonne volonté. Je parle de moi-même, que moi, je ne suis pas issue du secteur privé. Moi, j'ai travaillé toujours dans le non-profit auparavant. J'ai travaillé pour plusieurs organisations non gouvernementales et notamment plus de 10 ans au CICR. Donc, j'ai décidé de travailler dans le secteur privé pour amener un changement depuis l'intérieur. Et parce que c'est là où j'ai eu l'impression que je pouvais vraiment faire une différence.
Il nous reste environ 5 minutes. Maybe we'll look to the future. Are you hopeful for the future?
Yeah, you have to be. I think if you want to change things, you have to believe you can change them. One thing which in the immediate future I could perhaps draw attention to is that as a direct consequence, frankly, political consequence of what happened at Rana Plaza, the ILO's conference in June here in Geneva will be having what I think is a first of its type, a major global debate on the management of supply chains and how to promote decent work in supply chains. So in June, we'll be having, from all of our 187 member states, governments, trade unions, employers, coming and having this discussion. And I think, because I agree with what's just been said, nobody could claim that trying to clean up and ensure decent standards in supply chains is a simple task. It's complex, extremely complex. But because it's complex means we really have to make more effort to do it. There are some quite distinct views out there. You know, if a company says, I'm sorry, my supply chain is too complicated, it's too long for me to guarantee decent labor practices in that supply chain, there is an argument which says, well, you have an illegitimate business model and should change it. And that's one line of argument. And it's not the ILO's position, but it's out there. Others would say that the responsibilities of a company does stop at a certain level along a supply chain. Well, these are debates we have to have. And I do think, and I'm sounding like a scratch record, we have to make sure we define what we expect of governments, what we expect of employers, direct employers, and buyers, who are not direct employers, but at the end make the most of the money at the end of the supply chain.
And Babul, yeah, the final word maybe for you. Are you hopeful for the future?
হ্যাঁ, আসলে পরিবর্তন হবে এবং পরিবর্তনের জন্য সবার আসলে একসাথে কাজ করতে হবে।
Yes, change is around the horizon, but in order to bring about change, we all have to work together.
সাপ্লাই চেইনে যাবার আগে যে বায়ারদের যে কোড অফ কন্ট্রাক্টটা আছে সেটার ভিতরে একটা মূল বিষয় হলো যে দেশেরই কারখানা বা কলকারখানা থাক সেই দেশে যে লোকাল লেবার ল আছে সেটা বাস্তবায়ন করতে হবে। এটা কিন্তু কোড অফ কন্ট্রাক্টের ভিতরে একটা প্রথম শর্ত থাকে।
So the supply chains need to ensure that the code of conduct needs to be effected in the countries, and the labor laws in the domestic country where the garments are being produced need to be abided by.
যদি এই লেবার লটা যদি যথাযথভাবে মানে বা মেনে চলে যে কোম্পানিগুলো, তাহলে শ্রমিকেরা কিন্তু অনেক ভালো থাকে বা তাদের নিরাপত্তার বিষয়টা কিন্তু নিশ্চিত হয়।
If the employers abide by the existing labor laws in the countries, then the state of workers in the countries would be much better.
তবে আমাদের একটা বিষয় মনে রাখতে হবে, যখন কিছু ঘটে যায় তখনই আমরা একটা মনোযোগ দেই। যেমন রানা প্লাজা ঘটে যাওয়ার পর আমরা সবাই কিন্তু মনোযোগ দিয়েছি, কিন্তু কিছু মানুষ মরার বা শ্রমিক মৃত্যু হওয়ার আগে যদি আমরা সবাই মনোযোগ দেই, তাহলে আমরা এই ধরনের দুর্ঘটনা থেকে বা শ্রমিকদের অধিকার ন্যায্যভাবে বাস্তবায়ন হবে।
We need to pay attention to these sort of things before such a tragedy like Rana Plaza happens. So we need to ensure that these codes of conduct, we don't wait until a tragedy like the Rana Plaza tragedy happened for us to kind of abide by it.
যে বাংলাদেশে যদি বাংলাদেশেও আমাদের আইএলও অফিস আছেন, আমরা জানি যে আসলে রানা প্লাজার পূর্বে তাদেরও তেমন কিন্তু কর্মকাণ্ড আমাদের চোখে পড়েনি, কিন্তু রানা প্লাজার পরে বাংলাদেশে আইএলও অনেকগুলো কর্মকাণ্ড হাতে নিয়েছেন।
The ILO office in Bangladesh has investigated and taken control of situation after the Rana Plaza tragedy.
তো তারাও যদি পূর্বে যদি ভালোভাবে যে ত্রিপক্ষীয় যে আইএলওর যে ত্রিপক্ষীয় আছে সেখানে যদি ভালোভাবে গুরুত্ব দিত, তাহলে আমার মনে হয় যে আরও অনেকটা সুবিধা হতো।
Had the ILO officials in Bangladesh paid more attention to the grave conditions, working conditions, before the Rana Plaza tragedy, then probably it could have been averted.
এবং বাংলাদেশের যে আইএলও অফিস বা আইএলও স্টাফ আছে, তারা সবসময় আমরা যেটা দেখি সরকার এবং ম্যানুফ্যাকচারের দিকেই বেশি নজর দেয়, লেবার লিডার বা ওয়ার্কার্স রাইটসের দিকে তাদের নজরটা খুবই আমরা কম দেখতে পাই, কিন্তু আমরা ইকুয়াল দেখতে চাই।
The ILO officials in Bangladesh need to pay more attention to the demands of the trade union leaders as well, rather than just listening to what the employers and the government has to say.
যে রানা প্লাজার পূর্বে ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন, গার্মেন্টস সেক্টরে ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন একেবারে পলিটিক্যালি ব্যান্ড ছিল, কিন্তু আইএলও এখানে ওই সময় কোনো ধরনের উদ্যোগ বা কোনো ভূমিকা বাংলাদেশের জন্য নেয়নি।
Prior to Rana Plaza tragedy, the trade union movement the trade unions in the garment sector were completely banned, and it was and the ILO didn't make sure or ensure that such a thing didn't happen.
এখন ট্রেড ইউনিয়ন আবার গার্মেন্টস সেক্টরে অনেক কঠিন হয়েছে। আমি আশা করি আইএলওর ডাইরেক্টর এখানে আছেন, পরবর্তী কনভেনশন যেখানে হবে উনি আমাদের দেশের সরকারকে উনি এই বিষয়টা তুলতে পারবেন।
So he urges the director to take it up with the government later.
We'll let the directors answer shortly if possible
শুধু
before taking questions.
শুধু সাপ্লাই চেইনের থাকলেই হবে না, এখানে আসলে সবারই দায়িত্ব আছে। যে যেখান থেকে পারে সেখান থেকে যদি আমরা কথা বলা শুরু করি, তাহলে আমার মনে হয় যে আজকের যে ছবিতে যে শ্রমিকদের অবস্থা দেখেছি সেখান থেকে আমরা মুক্তি পাবো।
So yeah, it's also the responsibility of all of us present here, and not just the supply chains, to effect change. And only then can we effect positive change in the conditions of the workers.
Thank you. Do you want to add a word?
Well, just a word. I'll be back in Bangladesh in December. I was in Bangladesh before Rana Plaza. I was working with the trade unions for 20 years before Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. The trade unions were not banned in the garment sector. They were very ineffective, and they had a very hard time. They weren't banned. So, yeah, it is one of the tragic things of history that it takes a Rana Plaza to focus international attention. I could have not got a hearing for trade union rights in Bangladesh from international business. I could have not got a hearing about supply chain management internationally before Rana Plaza. It sometimes takes those tragedies to do it. But to say that work wasn't taking place before is not true. And by the way, our office, we're running a $24 million project in Bangladesh, works very, very hard with the trade union movement, as we do with the employers and as we do with government to try and bring change.
Okay, I think these two are gonna have a lot of things to say to each other, but maybe a little bit later. And now we're gonna take questions from the public because they're waiting and they need to go to bed at some point. Alors, monsieur. Je ne vous vois pas beaucoup, c'est ça le problème.
Oui, alors il y a deux points qui n'ont pas été très mis en évidence dans le film, comme par exemple la condition de la vie des travailleurs. Mais par exemple, juste pour que les gens se rendent un peu compte, on peut imaginer que les esclaves, il y a 2 ou 3 siècles en arrière, étaient mieux traités que les travailleurs maintenant. Parce que de ce temps-là, ils étaient blanchis, nourris, parce qu'il fallait bien pour travailler qu'ils mangent correctement, et toutes ces choses que maintenant, avec les aumônes qu'on leur donne, parce qu'on ne peut pas appeler ça des salaires, ils arrivent à peine à vivre avec ça. Deuxième chose, il y a un point très important. On entend beaucoup que les entreprises essayent de faire quelque chose. On demande qu'elles fassent quelque chose pour les salaires. Mais ce que l'on voit dans la réalité, c'est qu'il y a un pays africain qui donne des assurances à toutes ces grandes compagnies en disant que les salaires ne monteront pas. Et ils ont construit des usines immenses pour justement court-circuiter les autres pays qui deviennent chers avec $3 par jour. Et ça, c'est un énorme problème. Comment voulez-vous qu'on améliore les choses s'ils continuent indéfiniment dans ce sens-là du business? L'autre point qui est très important, et ça je me réfère peut-être au public, c'est que nous aussi on doit agir. Alors, première chose, c'est de ne plus aller acheter dans ces magasins tant qu'il n'y aura pas une traçabilité. En attendant, vous allez chez Caritas, le CSP et toutes ces entreprises qui, eux, en plus, aident les pauvres gens ici. Donc ça, c'est déjà une très bonne chose. Un autre point, peut-être pour le BIT, est-ce qu'il peut faire pression pour que ce genre de film soit vu par tous les élèves dans les pays occidentaux entre 1 et 2 fois par année pour les enfants qui ont plus que 10 ans? Parce que c'est ça le problème. Comment voulez-vous qu'ils sachent quelque chose? À l'école, on ne leur dit rien. Parce que moi-même, qui suis devenu végétarien, c'est là que j'ai appris comment on massacre les animaux. On ne me l'a jamais dit à l'école. Et ça, c'est un exemple.
Is there a lack of information?
You know, I'm sort of convinced, and here I am somewhat optimistic. I take the point about education and information. I think the way information can now, not only can be, but is being spread basically through social media, is a tremendous opportunity. Sure, a film like that would be great, but I really think that the great sort of coalition building, mobilizing instrument of our time is social media. Whether that's done formally through schools or through other informal circles, I'm not sure, but I certainly agree with the point that's made.
Une autre question?
My question about to the ILO, in terms of the pressure that we can bring to both governments and private sector enterprise for triple bottom line objectives. Because one of the objects in the movie was to talk a lot about the necessity for private enterprise to make profits. And so, you know, I think it's quite courageous for Bata to show up here and to have some things to say with respect to having other family-oriented values. And what are the ways in which, in terms of legislation, but also in terms of what governments can do to bring those CSR and ecological considerations into the marketplace?
I think it was directed to you, but...
Well, absolutely, the triple bottom line is essential. I mean, I am encouraged that governments are beginning with the big industrialized countries of Western Europe to start to move down this road. You know, that G8 grouping that Chancellor Merkel chaired last year, the big names, they actually took an initiative precisely designed, it's called a Vision Zero initiative, to have companies participate, companies from there based in their own countries, in precisely the type of initiative. The Vision Zero means no accidents at work, that would lead us to this type of taking of responsibility. Now, I think government, I repeat, is a big part of this, but it's about coalitions. It's very much about the type of activism that we're seeing displayed tonight. I think this is one area where governments will be responsive. I also think that companies, and I ought to also applaud Bata's presence on this panel tonight, I think companies, it's quite interesting to see how companies react. and you can look at the same thing and draw different conclusions. It's very clear that companies are extremely worried about their reputation, because if they have something very, very nasty happen, implication classically in forced labor, it happened to Nestle recently. If it's about child labor, it happened to Nike, they suffer. So I think reputational insurance through doing the right thing is a very much a bottom line issue. Now, I happen to think we can align government action, company action, NGO coalitions, trade union action to make real progress in the matter. And just, to go back to this discussion we'll be having in Geneva in June, I think this is a moment at the ILO when we can try and put these pieces into some sort of constellation where we can move forward qualitatively. Because global supply chains are and will be the business model of the future. This is how production is and will increasingly be organized. And national regulation doesn't get the job done by itself any longer. That's a pre-globalization response, I think.
Thank you, Guy. Question here. Une question au milieu, peut-être pour quelqu'un d'autre que pour Monsieur Ryder, pour lui qui se repose quelques instants.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to thank the speakers for excellent contributions in reaction to the film. The film basically showed the need or demonstrated the need for a top-down approach. But I also feel that there's a very strong need for a bottom-up approach. Workers in Bangladesh do not have the information. They are not necessarily empowered to be advocates themselves. And I realize they're perhaps restrained from being advocates themselves, but they need to have the information. They need to have the ability to be able to react in a positive way, to be able to make changes in their workplace. So I think beside struggling and beside trying to declare ourselves for a top-down approach, we also need to figure out how to empower the worker to be able to represent him or herself, and also to represent themselves in a positive way, in an effective way, to foster change. I'm not sure there's an answer to the question. It's simply an observation, but maybe Guy, I don't know if you'd react to that, or perhaps the gentleman from Bangladesh, but I think it's a very important consideration. Thank you.
Babul, do you want to answer to that question about the workers needing to be empowered in Bangladesh, needing to know more, maybe?
আসলে যে ওয়ার্কার নিজের বিশেষ করে বাংলাদেশের ওয়ার্কার যে যারা কাজ করে তারা গ্রামগঞ্জ থেকে আসছে এবং তারা কম শিক্ষিত, তারাও অনেক সময় তাদের অধিকার সম্পর্কে জানে না।
The workers who work in these factories are mostly from the rural areas. They're uneducated and they don't know about their rights.
তো সেখানে যে আসলে এই সাপ্লাই চেইনের পাশাপাশি যেটা মনে করি যে বাংলাদেশ থেকে যে আইএলও বেশ অনেকগুলো প্রোগ্রাম নিয়েছে শ্রমিকদেরকে সচেতন করার জন্য, এই ধরনের কর্মকাণ্ডগুলো যদি শান্তশিষ্টভাবে যদি বাস্তবায়ন হয়ে যায়, তখন ওয়ার্কারের অধিকার ওয়ার্কারও দাবি করতে পারবে এবং তার মালিকের সাথে দর কষাকষির মাধ্যমে যে ভালো একটা কর্মপরিবেশ সৃষ্টি করতে পারবে।
So the ILO has certain, I think, workshops and seminars through which they try to educate these workers about their rights and how to negotiate basically with the management. So through I think, initiatives like this, positive change can be effected.
Good. Thank you. Maybe yeah.
Just add one thing. I think I would fully agree with what you said, that it's extremely important, this bottom-up approach, but we also have to be aware it is very, very dangerous for a lot of people. We saw the situation in Cambodia, what happened there. We know several situations in Bangladesh, in other countries, and I think we here also do have a duty, and I don't know if some media are still in the room, but also media has a very important role in actually spread the word and look at the situations and to condemn violence, because in many situations this sort of public eye on the situation is the only insurance for the workers for some safety. And I think this duty we may never forget.
Yes, thank you. Another question, maybe, Monsieur tout devant.
Yes, a very quick question for both of you. To our gentlemen, the trade unionists from Bangladesh, why don't you enter politics and become the first socialist president of Bangladesh? After all, West Bengal has had a communist government for generations. Why not East Bengal? And a question to Guy Ryder, were there unions in the British Indies? And yes or not, why after 2/3 of a century of independence, when the Bengali were empowered enough to house the Britons and then to house the Pakistanis, why the net outcome of their empowerment in labor issue was Rana Plaza?
Okay, maybe first Guy and then Babul.
Well, I wasn't around during the British colonial era in India. I think the thing to say about trade unions all around what were the British colonies is they were the leading actors in the independence struggle. That was true in India. I can't speak for Bangladesh because I don't know my history well enough. But clearly what you've seen in Bangladesh, I mean, I take the point, that after, 45 years after independence, you get Rana Plaza. It's a combination of circumstances, and it's absolutely unacceptable, of course. But here we come back to this paradox or this dilemma that we have. You know, if there is one thing that has brought down poverty remarkably in Bangladesh in the last 15, 20 years, and Bangladesh is one of the success stories in the world in poverty reduction, it's been this garment industry. It's a dilemma. It has been one of the locomotives of poverty alleviation in Bangladesh, and yet you see the evidence of the film. And it really is a question of, and I think it's been said by Babul very strongly, it's upgrading, it's improving this industry, but it's not putting an end to it.
Okay, so now the big question for Babul. So, when are you starting?
যে আসলে বাংলাদেশের যে রাজনীতি নিয়ে যদি আমি আসলে কথা বলি যে আসলে আমি রাজনীতি যে পছন্দ করি না তা না, আসলে বাংলাদেশের রাজনীতি আসলে এটা দুই ভাগে একটা মানে এটা পরিবারগতভাবে আসলে একটা বিভক্তি হয়ে আছে।
The politics, so he likes politics, but the problem with politics in Bangladesh is that it's very dynastic in nature.
সো এখানে আসলে গণতন্ত্র বাংলাদেশ আমরা যেটা মনে করি একটা গণতান্ত্রিক দেশ, যে পাকিস্তানের কাছ থেকে 1972 সালের স্বাধীনতা আমরা অর্জন করেছি, কিন্তু তারপর থেকে আসলে যে গণতন্ত্রের যে টেকসইটা এখন পর্যন্ত আমরা এখন অর্জন করতে পারিনি।
We were able to get independence from Pakistan in the 1970s, but after that, democracy has not really been stable in Bangladesh.
স্যার, আমি রাজনীতিতে আসতেছি না, তার একটা মাত্র কারণ হলো যে আমি একজন ওয়ার্কার ছিলাম, আমি ওয়ার্কার রাইটস নিয়ে আমি সন্তুষ্ট থাকতে চাই।
He doesn't really want to enter full-fledged politics because he wants to fight for the workers and the workers' rights.
And so, unless your son or family, you were meaning that unless you know somebody, your family's been in politics for a long time, it's very difficult to do anything.
আসলে আমি এটার উত্তর দেবো এভাবে যে যেখানে 4.5 মিলিয়ন গার্মেন্টস ওয়ার্কার আছে, সেখান থেকে যদি বিশেষ করে হলো যে 1 মিলিয়ন বা 1/2 মিলিয়ন ওয়ার্কারও যদি একত্রিত হয়, তাহলে শ্রমিকদের অধিকারের জন্য একটা রাজনীতি হয়ে যেতে পারে।
Out of the 4 million workers, if at least 1 million, they unite and they work together and they demand for their rights, positive change can be brought about.
এবং বাংলাদেশের যে জনসংখ্যা আছে যে 160 মিলিয়ন, তার ভিতর থেকে দেখা যায় যে অর্থাৎ মানে 16 কোটি, তার ভিতর দেখা যায় যে অর্ধেকের মতো অর্থাৎ 5 কোটি 20 লক্ষ হলো যে কর্মজীবী মানুষ, কিন্তু আসলে তাদের পক্ষের কোনো প্রতিনিধি সংসদও নেই এবং সরকারও নেই। অতএব এখানেও আসলে পরিবর্তন আসা উচিত এবং সেটার জন্য আসলে অনেক সময় অপেক্ষা করতে হবে। আর তার ভিতরে যে আপনার অর্ধেকের বেশি যে কর্মজীবী মানুষ 50 মিলিয়ন।
Okay, what he is basically saying is that so about 52 million out of the 160 million people are from the working class, and there is no representation of them in the politics, and it will take time to have a change in that.
Thank you.
যখনই এই চেঞ্জটা আসবে আসলে তখনই দেখা যাবে যে রাজনীতি করতে হবে না, তখন শ্রমিকেরাই এই রাজনীতির সাথে জড়িয়ে যাবে এবং তাদের জন্য কিভাবে সমাজ ব্যবস্থা হওয়া উচিত, তাদের জন্য কিভাবে একটা রাষ্ট্র হওয়া উচিত, তাদের পরিবারের জন্য কি কি কল্যাণমূলক কিছু হওয়া উচিত, তখন শ্রমিকেরাই সংসদে এই বিষয়ে আইন পাস করতে পারবে।
Once this change is brought about and workers have a proper say in the way governance is to happen, only then can positive change like this happen. Their working conditions can be negotiated.
আর একটু বলি যে সেটা হলো যে বর্তমান যে সংসদে গার্মেন্টস মালিকই আছে 32 জন এবং 300 জন সংসদ সদস্যের ভিতরে 65% হল যে বিজনেসম্যান, যেখানে শ্রমিকদের বৈধ কোনো প্রতিনিধি বা নির্বাচিত কোনো প্রতিনিধি নেই।
Out of the 300 parliamentarians, at least 32 are garment factory owners, and 65% are businessmen.
It's a pity because you're like a politician, you like to speak, so it would work otherwise. Maybe another question? Tout derrière, là, monsieur. Et après, madame.
I see here a kind of representation of almost all stakeholders of the garment industry, and I wanted to know how much is there exchange, how much coordination, how much collaboration are between these more powerless or powerless stakeholders to speak with one voice when they are talking with the government, when they are talking with the industry. So maybe from your personal experience, how much exchange I see, for example, the representative of Federation of Workers, I don't know how much exchange is there between them and the ILO, with NGOs, with campaigns, with the civic society. Is there a kind of repeated come together where they can exchange and try to coordinate this collective action to maybe make this change happen much faster? Or
it's a question for Mr. Akhter,
Okay,
right?
it's actually to all the panel.
Okay, go ahead.
আসলে সমন্বয়টা শ্রমিকদের পক্ষ থেকে তখনই আমরা পাই যখন আমরা চিৎকার করি যে আমি আমার অধিকার চাই, আমি নির্যাতিত, তখনই কেউ না কেউ সমন্বয় করতে চেষ্টা করে, কিন্তু সেটার জন্য অনেক বিলম্ব করতে হয়।
So we only get attention when we start shouting, and only then other stakeholders pay attention. So it only comes then.
প্রথমত আমরা প্রথম সমন্বয়ের চেষ্টা করি আমাদের যে সরকার আছে তার সাথে, বা তার পূর্বে আমরা চেষ্টা করি যে মালিক পক্ষের সাথে অথবা তাদের সমিতির সাথে, তারপর সরকারের সাথে। যখন দেখি যে আসলে আমাদের সাথে কেউ সমন্বয় করছে না, তখনই আমাদের সাপ্লাই চেনে বা আইএলওর মাধ্যমে যেভাবে হোক আমাদের সমন্বয়টা সাধন করার চেষ্টা করতে হয়। কিন্তু স্ব ইচ্ছায় প্রথম অবস্থায় আসলে লেবারদের অধিকারের ব্যাপারে কোনো পক্ষই স্ব ইচ্ছায় এগিয়ে আসে না।
First, we try to draw attention of the government, and even before that, of the industry owners. And only when these fail, we tend to go to the supply chain. And we see that when we actually start shouting, then only people pay attention to us.
আর অন্য এক কারণেও সরকার এবং মালিকপক্ষ আমাদের ওয়ার্কারদের সাথে সমন্বয় করে যখন ওয়ার্কাররা রাস্তায় নেমে আসে, যখন ওয়ার্কাররা আন্দোলন সংগ্রাম করে বা গ্যাদারিং সৃষ্টি করে, তখনও তারা অনেক সময় যে আমাদের কথা শোনে বা আমাদের সাথে সমন্বয় করে।
The only other time when the government actually tends to listen to us is when we are on the streets and we start demonstrating on the streets. At that time, government and other stakeholders also pay attention to us.
এবং বাংলাদেশ সরকার আসলে দুইটা বিষয় খুব ভয় পায়, যে সেটা হলো একটা হলো যে যদিও বেশি ওয়ার্কার মিলে আন্দোলন সংগ্রাম করে, তাহলে সেটাকে তারা গুরুত্ব দেয়, এবং অন্যথায় যদি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল একটা প্রেশার হয় তাহলে তারা এই অ্যাটেনশন দেয়। এবং ইন্টারন্যাশনাল প্রেশারটার একমাত্র অন্যতম মানে গুরুত্ব সহকারে সরকার নেওয়ার একটা কারণ হলো যে এই গার্মেন্টস সেক্টর থেকে আমাদের সরকার যে 85 বা 86% বৈদেশিক মুদ্রা অর্জন করে। যদি ইন্টারন্যাশনাল প্রেশার বা তাদের বা দেশের কোনো ঘটনার কারণে এটা যদি বন্ধ হয়ে যায় কিনা এই ভয়ের কারণে আসলে তখন ইন্টারন্যাশনাল প্রেশারটাকেও তারা অনেকটা গুরুত্ব সহকারে নেয়।
The government pays and reacts to two types of pressure. One is the demonstration by the workers, and the other is the international pressure, because the government fears that the big proportion of the foreign exchange, foreign earning that the country earns may be at stake if the international pressure is not responded.
Thank you. We have the time for one last question, I think. Là, il y a une dame ici au milieu à qui j'avais promis la parole.
Thank you. Thank you for this very wonderful debate. We are a lot of people here that maybe want to do something. And what can we do after we saw this image? Okay, there is a website, but what the activists do propose. And in my experience, I know about Amnesty International, which is proposing action in form of letters, where they propose a template, and they give the address and emails where to send it. And there is plenty of address and emails, and I have all my closet full of stickers I want to send later. What do you think will be the impact of such action, or what do you propose?
Madame Luginbühl?
Yeah, I think the impact depends a bit on the question and the brand. We actually make the experience that brands may react very differently to different questions. But the actions that you described actually are usual actions that we also do as clean clothes campaigns together with our partners. We have a system called urgent appeal system, where, for instance, when labor rights fights on the ground cannot be handled anymore nationally and need some international support, then this system is getting in place. That may be protest letters to governments to raise alarm, or so this type of actions. And of course, everyone is warmly welcome to join these actions of Clean Clothes campaign. We have also volunteers here from Berne Declaration. I think still some people waving if you turn around. We have volunteers here. They have regional groups that you can join to do also actions locally in your region. We have information outside this information desk where you're invited to also get some information with you. So these are some very practical things that I would suggest.
And maybe a final word from you, Guy, to the local consumer, shopper, become activist.
Yeah, I think what's come out of the debate is there are lots of buttons to be pushed here, and I think activism of the type that you're describing is absolutely essential to getting things done. I tend to believe that letting the brands know what you expect of them, that levels of behaviour that consumers will hold them to is extremely important. Hence the value of clean clothes and the activists around it. I also think, and sorry to keep saying it, you've got to tell your governments that you expect them also to hold companies to those standards of behavior. Because, you know, the standards of behavior which are appropriate for companies should not actually be decided by companies. In my mind, it's a matter of public policy and the public interest. So those are two buttons, I think, that you can, it's not one or the other, I think it's both.
So it means it's not only you who has to start in politics, it's like everybody else who watched this movie tonight. Thank you all to have debated, and thank you to have listened and to have come. Merci à tous d'être venus ce soir, et je vous souhaite une très belle soirée.